If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know just how difficult it can be to grow your company's culture beyond a pre-scheduled Zoom happy hour or occasional lunch and learn. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that. They're called CultureBot. CultureBot has devised what will likely become the gold standard for growing and blossoming a company culture inside of Slack. The app is like a sidekick for any HR or people professional, automating a lot of the mundane tasks you probably are forgetting to do on a daily basis. Things like birthday and work anniversary celebrations, team shoutouts and kudos, employee introductions, and remote games. It even has health and wellness tips and conversation starters. If that piques your interest, this will get you even more excited. Today, I'm able to share a special promotion for listeners of the podcast. You can get your first 6 months of CultureBot for 50% off. Plus, if your team is under 25 employees, CultureBot is free forever. So if you're looking for a way to create a culture of appreciation and drive increased engagement and togetherness across your team, I definitely recommend checking out CultureBot. Go to getculturebot.com/humanhr. That's getculturebot.com/humanhr to get the offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click right there. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for another week. I'm really glad that we have had so many amazing guest episodes and that I now can join as myself, by myself on this episode to talk to you about the ADA and accommodations and leaves and things like that. Because one of the more recent episodes that I shared with you, I think it was episode 114, so about a month ago came out, that was with Alex Gilbert. And we talked about ADHD and dyslexia, and specifically that she was diagnosed with these things, with these learning disabilities. And basically what that meant for her being in the workforce and what she's had to navigate, and how companies can be more supportive, more accommodating for folks like Alex who are dealing with these types of things every single day. And so it made me realize that maybe we needed to talk about how to actually navigate the accommodation process and the leave process. So with that, I'm going to just jump right in. If you're watching this video, you might see me reading. If not, then just, sit back and enjoy the episode. So let's start at the top. What does ADA mean? What does EEOC mean? I think I've clarified these a few times, but in case you're new here, I'm going to do so again. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I believe it's commission. That one I'm not reading. And basically, the EEOC and the ADA kind of work hand in hand. The ADA is what tells us and specifies who is part of a protected class, which, of course, we always hear race, gender, creed, nationality, sexual orientation, et cetera, right? We always hear those things. But we don't always talk about disability. And we don't necessarily always talk about like even military status, right? So those things are, and those qualifications or qualifiers are, do fall under the ADA. The EEOC basically says that to be an equal opportunity employer, we have to be able to provide reasonable accommodations for those protected classes. Of course, we have to provide equal opportunity as well, but specifically to the ADA process and the accommodation process, when we say accommodations, they have to be reasonable accommodations, and businesses can make decisions to deny accommodation requests if they cause undue hardship on the business. So I know I've kind of shared a lot top level there. I'm going to break this down. When it comes to someone saying, hey, HR person, business leader, I need an accommodation, it's our responsibility to ask numerous questions, right? And to understand what they're asking for, what the request is, if there's any understanding as to what is requiring or causing the accommodation request. But I want to preface by saying that at no point can we or should we be asking what were you diagnosed with? Why do you need an accommodation? We have to be much more mindful than asking questions like that because it could violate someone's privacy rights. It could violate laws. So you have to be really, really careful and considerate of what a person's right to their privacy looks like. So at no point should you ask someone what their diagnosis is, or if we are talking about a disability, for example, or if they even need a medical procedure. Like if someone is providing a doctor's note, it shouldn't even say what they are experiencing or what they're dealing with. It should just say information or provide information about how long they need to be out, if there are any accommodations required or requested. So just keep that in mind. Now, if an employee comes to you and says that they need an accommodation, your first question is to ask what the accommodation is that they are requesting. And you have to engage in what's called an interactive process. And I'll make sure that there are tons and tons of links in the show notes for you, so that you can access these later. But basically, the interactive process is a process where you're asking kind of a series of questions. You go through a checklist. Most companies kind of derive their own, but there are some available resources online, and templates and things like that. Sometimes they have pay barriers, but your company might have one already. If not, try and check out some of those resources in the show notes to, do your due diligence to ensure that you are proceeding with an interactive process in the way that should be done. So, at a high level, the interactive process, again, is a series of questions. It's ensuring that there is a doctor's note provided in the event that there is a medical necessity here. In most cases, accommodations do come from a medical need, right? Like when we think about pregnancy, if we think about ADHD or dyslexia, there could be accommodations for that. If someone is going through a surgery or they broke their ankle, right? Like there are so many examples of where medical issues come with a need for accommodation. I'm trying to think if there's ever a moment where someone needs accommodation outside of a medical need. And there's nothing coming to my mind right now. Oh, actually, if someone is on a military leave or they're called to active duty, for example, that could be where you go from like an accommodation instead to a leave of absence, right? So this is where like accommodations and leaves kind of go hand in hand. Not everything is going to require an accommodation. Not everything is going to require a leave, but it's going to be through your not only your discretion, but also your questions asked through the interactive process that will enable you to understand what um, you know next steps look like for this employee and for the business. So let's just take a simple example of if someone is pregnant and they are now put on light duty because they're pregnant or whatever, right? The doctor's not going to tell you, the medical provider is not going to tell you, the employee might not even tell you specifically why they need this accommodation. Again, we should not be asking. So, in the event that an employee says, "Hey, I'm pregnant, I'm on light duty, I need to sit every 15 minutes or I need to sit every 30 minutes and I have to take 2 lunch breaks." Let's just say, right? Um that's when, again, you're going to engage in the interactive process and you're going to understand specifically what the accommodation requests are. So again, sitting, maybe it's potentially a reduction in what they can lift, taking more meals, whatever that is, right? Then you have to understand if there is supporting documentation. So this is where a doctor's note comes in. One of the misconceptions I would say about accommodations, though, is this that only doctors can provide medical notes, which is not necessarily the case. What the ADA tells us, and I believe what the EEOC tells us, is that doctor's notes, or I should say, medical provider notes, healthcare provider notes, can be from nurses, nurse practitioners, um, therapists, psychologists, right? Like, depending on the situation, I think it specifically says that that businesses can ask for a medical note from an individual or from a healthcare provider that is an expert in or specializes in the situation at hand. Now, obviously, that could get a little gray because we're not asking specifically what the situation is, but if you as a business are trying to ensure that the medical note is sufficient, you could say, "Hey, does this come from someone who specializes in what you are seeking, medical attention for? You don't have to provide me any information about what you're looking for, but I just want to make sure that this note is coming from someone that knows you and is seeing you," because I think that's also in the language that um, I actually have it right here, that essentially healthcare professionals who um, do have an understanding of the person's background and potential impairment or functional limitations, either with direct knowledge within the employee's specific impairment or limitations, or who has expertise in the medical condition. That is where the medical note will suffice, coming from potentially anyone, right? So, as an example, if this employee gives you a note from a pharmacist, and because it says CVS pharmacy or something at the top, you could say, "Hey, I'm happy to continue to engage in the interactive process to ensure that we accommodate you however we can, but I will need an updated note coming from someone who's either treating you, or who has expertise in your specific medical condition." Again, I'm not asking what that is. I would tread lightly. I don't know that I've ever had to push back on a note that I've received. And you should also know that you can't call the healthcare provider and ask them questions. Just stay away from that territory. Just, this is a moment where we're trusting what the employee is providing us, right? So, again, with this example, let's say the employee is pregnant and they are sharing, that they have accommodation requests. You're going through the interactive process. You have a note from them, and it certifies that they have this light duty restriction. They can't lift more than 5 pounds. They have to sit every 15 or 30 minutes, and they have to take an extra lunch. In the event that their job can absolutely not accommodate this, let's say they um, are, I don't know, work in the municipality, and they are, they pick up recycling cans or the garbage from each home or residence in the town, right? That could potentially be or cause undue hardship on the organization, because there's no reasonable way to accommodate the restrictions that the medical or healthcare provider is saying this person is restricted with. In the event that you work in retail, for example, and this is totally reasonable, and maybe it causes a little bit of difficulty because of the sitting. Maybe they're like a salesperson and it's hard for them to sit. This is where you would have to figure out what is a reasonable accommodation to ensure that we can meet these requests where possible, right? And in my experience, what we did was we would move someone to be a cashier or a guest service representative, because sitting in those sections of the business or in those areas of the business was much easier and much more simple to accommodate than if someone worked in logistics and unloaded, a truck with shipment, for example. So I'm trying to give like context here so we can think in real life what this looks like. But in essence, like when you are thinking through reasonable accommodations, you do have to make every effort to make it work. Again, without causing undue hardship on the business. In some cases, there will be employees who are reasonably accommodated, right? So let's say this employee is moved from a salesperson to a cashier, and that's a reasonable accommodation for them. But then they go and they get more restrictions from their healthcare provider. There might not be a way to accommodate them. So that's when that accommodation potentially moves into a leave of absence. And again, it's through the art of questions and the art of questioning that will allow you to understand when this kind of moves into that arena. If this employee says, "Hey, my doctor said I'm still not taking it easy enough, and now I can't be on my feet at all. I'm on bed rest. And I want to work. I don't know what I can do." In the event that the business does not enable remote work or even a fully seated, experience for this employee, then you might have to ask that, like, is there any flexibility in the accommodation request? Which, again, I mean, if there's a doctor's note saying, or a medical note saying the opposite, that they are fully on bed rest, there's likely going to be some sort of information about when they can return to work. Like in situations like that, people are probably, and most often, given a note to be relieved of their immediate job functions, and to be placed out of work because of these things. It's important for any business to focus on their culture, employee well being, and strategic growth. But without the proper tools, it can be next to impossible to support the people behind your success. That's why you need Namely, the all in one HR solution that empowers you to engage and develop your people in one intuitive platform. Namely's award winning technology covers your essential HR, payroll, and compliance needs all in one place. Whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees, Namely's modern and integrated platform is designed to be used by everyone, every day. With a mobile app and elegant UI, Namely empowers employees with self-service tools to request PTO, acknowledge peers, review pay stubs, and enroll in benefits. Namely helps you easily handle everything from onboarding, payroll, time tracking, open enrollment, employee engagement, and so much more, so that you can get the time and data you need to drive the initiatives your company really cares about. I want you to simplify your HR processes with Namely, so I've arranged a special offer for my listeners. Right now, get a free month of unlimited access to Namely's all-in-one HR platform, but only when you go to namely.com/humanhr. Remember, go to namely.com/humanhr for your free month today. So you might not have to figure that out. It probably will be spelled out for you. Again, in most situations where, um, you know, this is a medical necessity. So in that case, especially when dealing with pregnancy or any type of parental leave, like, you do have to think about how this impacts their FMLA if they are eligible, and how that impacts all of their leaves, and what that looks like for the duration of their experience being out for their medical condition. When it comes to pregnancy, I think most people are probably, pretty much forward facing about this, because you at some point can't hide it. And so people tend to be pretty open. But in other cases where you're dealing with a medical condition where someone's placed out, you could be left in the dark, right? Again, you're not going to ask what someone is dealing with, but let's say that they're dealing with anxiety or depression, and they're or stress related, situations, and their doctor or their healthcare provider removes them from work for a period of time. As an organization, you might have leave of absence options for people outside of medical conditions, where maybe you have an unpaid personal leave, or a personal leave in general where PTO can be applied. But in most cases, again, when it's a medical condition, if someone's eligible for FMLA, then they can be eligible for that time, whether it's intermittent or concurrent. And so when I say intermittent, that means, you could take like 3 days here and 5 days there. It's not all within 12 weeks back to back. And I realize that this is super US focused, but I do think that across the board, from what I know in Canada, from what I know in India, there are very similar approaches to these situations. And I think it's always good to have a best practice in mind, that when someone needs accommodation, that we're asking those questions, that we're certifying through a medical note, from a healthcare provider, and that we're ensuring that we're doing our due diligence to provide a reasonable accommodation. So let's take a situation like ADHD or dyslexia. And as Alex said, you don't, and as I've said already a million times on this episode, you don't have to disclose what you have or what you're experiencing, but you can certainly ask for support, right? So if someone comes to you saying that they require closed captioning on meetings because of lack of hearing, because of dyslexia, because of, something, maybe it is ADHD, right? Like something that they are experiencing. Again, they might not share this with you. You then have to be able to discern, is this an accommodation request, or is this something culturally as an organization that we can just turn on for everyone, right? So in the event that it's not something organizationally or culturally that we're going to turn on for everyone, and this, you know, transcription or closed captioning is only enabled for one person. You do have to use this as a almost like a light bulb moment. Let me go through the interactive process to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence to ensure that I'm, you know, understanding of the full request. Now, if someone is like, I don't want to make it a big deal, it's not a big deal. I just, you know, I learn differently, I think differently, like they might say something along those lines, then you can take it upon yourself to kind of ease their mind that this is not something that's going to negatively impact them. And that, you know, as an employer, equal employment opportunity is paramount, and that we have to ensure that we are providing reasonable accommodations if something like this comes up. And you can also ensure and reiterate that that person understands that at no point do you need to understand any condition that they might have, but you just need to understand what their requests might be. In some of these circumstances, you might not even ask for a medical note. Of course, it's a best practice to do so if there is some considerable medical condition, like any of these that we've talked about. But sometimes employers will use discretion and say, okay, you know what, this is this is not something that we wouldn't do for others. Let's, you know, let's just full steam ahead, provide this for everyone or provide this for this person. If someone else asks, we can provide it for them as well. Now, when we think about that, providing for others, and we think about, you know, setting precedents, I do want to be clear that people have different experiences. People have different opportunities, different challenges, different medical needs. Just because you provide one accommodation for one person with one medical condition doesn't mean you're going to provide the same accommodations for another person with the same medical condition. Their requests could be two totally different requests. The point in setting a precedent is making sure that if someone presents the same thing as another person, that they are then treated equally. The precedent is set, right? So those who have the same medical condition and the same request as another person with a medical condition and the same request, that they have the same access to those accommodations that you've already set. It's not to say that everyone's going to be completely the same or that every accommodation is going to be completely the same, but rather that if you accommodate one person by sitting every 15 minutes, giving them two lunches and taking them off of, you know, off of their feed or off of the sales floor and putting them as a cashier, that if someone else with the same presenting requests can have access to that accommodation as well. So I hope that that is clear and that that made sense, because I realize I'm kind of like going through a few of these examples at one time, but this is the reality of HR. Like things could be happening at all at once. A million things could be happening all at once, and they could all be urgent and important. And we have to figure out what precedent has been set. How is this different, if at all, from a prior situation or the precedent that was already set? And if this is something new, what precedent are we willing to set in the event that something else occurs? So I want to give another example here. If someone requests to go out for a personal leave because their child is getting married and they want to take 5 weeks off because they're getting married in another country, that is not a job protected leave, right? And a personal leave, an unpaid leave, sometime, you know, if it's not attributed to a job protected leave, those are totally at the employee's risk and you know, it's their prerogative, right? So if someone is requesting this 5-week personal leave, and you approve it, someone else, whether it's 2 months, 5 years, a year later, if they present the same request and they say, I want to take 5 weeks off or even 4 weeks off for my child's wedding, or for, you know, to travel to another country for a family member who needs me, you have to be able to reasonably like mitigate any risk there to ensure that people are being treated equitably and that there is equal opportunity to these accommodations. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, it's not a job protected leave. We don't have to accommodate them at all. And you're right. If a company says we're not making any exceptions to this, we're not allowing personal leaves for any, you know, travel related anything, like it has to be a job protected leave or it has to be PTO, you totally can do that. There are companies out there that don't choose to do that and allow personal leaves, but have some policies around it that say, no more than 4 weeks or no more than 3 weeks. And you have to use your PTO to, on top of that, which then actually would be job protected because they're being paid for that time. But, and that is totally and ultimately up to the company's discretion. But I do, want to be clear that when it comes to accommodations, even though that is not necessarily an accommodation, that it does result in setting a precedent. So whether it's an accommodation for someone who has a learning disability or a physical disability, doesn't it, those the access to accommodation and reasonable accommodation is the right of that employee, and our obligation as leaders to ensure that they have access to those things just as much as someone who is asking to be placed on a non-job protected leave. We can either choose to accommodate and enable this a leave for them, or time off for them, or we can choose not to accommodate. But again, there isn't that same requirement to accommodate because it's not necessarily a medical condition, right? So hopefully you can see the differences there. The other thing that I want to point out is that sometimes people are not necessarily going to come to you with a request for an accommodation. They might even go to their leaders and say, "Oh, I need to like take an extra hour in the day to do X, Y, or Z because, I have to sit down, like my feet are starting to swell up, right? Whatever that might be, or I get headaches after looking at the computer for 2 hours straight, so I need to take breaks." In our world, that might trigger immediately for us to start having a conversation about, what is beyond this and if there needs to be an interactive discussion. But it's also our responsibility to ensure that all business leaders are clear on like what should trigger a light bulb moment in their minds to partner with HR. So I would encourage all of you at some point, if you are responsible for training, or if you are, working with other leaders within the organization directly, that there is some sort of created awareness around this. In my experience, most of the time, there isn't a whole lot of awareness, unless there is that training from the business leader, from other business leaders outside of HR, because it's not their specialty, right? So a leader might say, "Oh yeah, they've been taking breaks every 2 hours because of their headaches. It's no problem." But for you as an HR leader, your light bulb is going off and you're like, well, actually, it's probably not a problem, but we have a process that we have to go to in the future. Make sure you partner with me if at any point someone's job is being altered or limited, or the work that they can do has limitations, because that triggers a potential need to go through an interactive process for accommodations. And that is like most of the time, I feel like the training happens on the job when something comes up and there's a learning moment. So just keep that in mind, that not everyone is going to know these things. And so we have to, again, do our due diligence to level set expectations and ensure that all leaders, especially people leaders, are familiar with or aware of processes like this, so that they can at least immediately partner with you. I always kind of say that, if at any point someone's job changes, or like what they can do within their job changes, if they ever express that they need to work differently or have, I don't want to use the word accommodations, but have some sort of accommodation made by you within the team, that they have to immediately partner with HR, because not only is this an obligation for us to that employee, but also we want to make sure that that you as the leader are not setting a precedent that we can't maintain. And that is kind of where you also start to build better relationships, right? If you are clued into and have a pulse on what's going on within the organization, and you're available to these leaders for supportive moments like this, I find that those are hugely impactful on building relationships as well. So hopefully, now that you've heard, hopefully that you've listened to episode 114 with Alex, and we're thinking about actively how we can ensure that we are providing a safe and accommodating workforce, and or I should say workplace, for people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental disabilities, whatever, right, emotional disabilities, and et cetera, I should say, that you now are equipped or better equipped, hopefully, with the tools that you need to ensure that you are providing reasonable accommodation and that you do feel confident if, for whatever reason, the accommodation would cause undue hardship on the business, that you are confident in what that looks like as well. And I just want to close with saying that if you do not have someone that is a legal entity, an attorney, or someone that can support you in these decisions based on their experience or their skill set or their expertise, that I strongly encourage that you take a partner before you make any of these decisions. So whether it's an attorney or a more experienced HR leader, you should make sure that you are clear on your obligations and what you are providing. It's not to say that every time you approve an accommodation, you're going to talk to your attorney. You shouldn't be doing that. It's very expensive. Don't do that. But if you are about to deny an accommodation request, or if you are concerned about an accommodation request, I would strongly encourage that you take an attorney as a partner. And then anything in between, taking another experienced HR leader as a partner is helpful as well, inclusive of those moments where you might be reaching out to an attorney as well. So, with that, I think that concludes all of the HR stuff that people usually find boring. And so I hope I was able to provide some energy to this subject, because I do think it's really important that we're clear again on our obligations and on what the employee's rights are. So, and these are, at the end of the day, you're an employee too, so you should know your rights also. But thank you all so much for being here for another week. You know what to do. I'm going to see you next week. I don't think there's a guest episode next week, but regardless, I'll see you there. Please, if you have any additional questions on this, please feel free to contact me via email at contact@hrtracy.com or through my DMs on Instagram or on LinkedIn. And I'll see you next week. Take care. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.